Hi folks. In this week's homework assignment, I've given out what turns out to be a pretty tough problem. Now, I'm going to go through this problem. This is a great power use example, so even if I'm not giving out this particular problem in my homework in the future, I think I'm going to hold on to this just to talk a little bit about how to solve some problems using, again, as I mentioned, some power use features that you won't find in most textbooks. So let's take a look at what the problem is, and then I want to go back in and review some things that we've talked about in the past, because now as we get a little bit more advanced into understanding the select statements and some of those groupings and the join statements, what I've talked about in the past now I can bring forward a little bit, and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense. So the problem we're looking at right now says, in a single select, which manager has the greatest number of wins? So if we go back in our database right now and we take a look, we see that we have a managers table, and inside that managers table we have a manager ID, we have a player ID that's going to associate back to the players table, because remember we talked about the players table as being a combination both of players and of managers, and so this is what differentiates those, how we identify those separately. We have the year that they managed, the team that they managed, which league they managed in, American or National League. Some of this other stuff's not so pertinent. Number of games they managed, the wins and the losses. Now this is interesting because this is an example of poor normalization right here. Pardon me, because if I know how many total games that manager managed and I know how many wins they had, all I've got to do is subtract the number of wins from the number of games, and I should come up with the number of losses. So I really shouldn't be storing this piece of information in. But again, I downloaded this data from Layman, and I try to keep it as common as possible. Perhaps in the future I might remove that. And really down below here we've got player manager, and it looks like there's two different variations of player manager. If we come back over and we select all data in here, I think they're both, the last two columns are the same thing. Let's see, yes. The first column is a yes or no, which is simply character yes or no, whereas the second column is a Boolean variation of the same thing. Really, again, this is redundancy. It looks like perhaps data at some point in time was being converted across and one column was left in. We don't need both columns. I could go back in and test to see if a particular value of player manager is equal to a Y, or I can go back in there and test for true false on this bit field right here. And again, it is a bit field, so a 1 meaning true and a 0 meaning false. But again, if you look back over here, here is our total number of wins. Now, before I go on, I want to talk a little bit about tables. When I ran this statement right here, the data that came back was basically in what we call a record set, but in other words, it's actually a table. It's made up of rows and columns. So the data could be a subset of the table as it's stored on the original table, okay, or the data could be the whole table itself. What do I mean? Well, of course, we've looked at this before. I could come back in here in the same statement and say I want to select all records from players. And if I run that, I get all player records returned back in here. And that's exactly a mirror image copy of the data as exists within the table itself. But this data down below here is a table nonetheless. It's a table on its own. We don't think of it that way commonly, but it is a table nonetheless that's being returned back. But I'm telling it, when you return back a table to me, give me all fields. And I can prove that again. If I wanted to come back over here to managers, and I do a right click on managers, and I say I want to take a look at what's inside of this table, things that we might have taken for granted before, is it gives me everything back. Now it throws in this default top 1,000. Let's pop that out here, and let's rerun that again. But it gives me back a mirror image copy of what's stored in that. So this data right here represents the table managers in its entirety. And again, I can prove that. I can even go a step further and prove that. Watch this. I could come back over here. Oops. I can take this table right here, and what I can do is I can treat it, or excuse me, this select statement, and I can treat it just like a table. And as I'm thinking about this, let's back up. I've told you before that I could take this select statement, in fact, we've demoed this and used it, and store it as a view, and that view acts just like a table. Well, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm not going to store it as a view. I'm going to sidestep that aspect of storing it as a view, because sometimes you just need a piece of data in a complex select statement maybe once or twice, but not enough that you actually physically want to store it into a view itself. So, but let me prove this. If I take this select statement right here and I surround it with parentheses, just like that, and I need to give it a table name, I call it my table, just like that. Okay. Now, what I can do is that guy right there represents a table called my table. We've done this before, folks. This is an alias. I can create an alias on this. Now, what we've done in the past, perhaps, is I've done the alias directly like that in the past. We looked at an example of that before. But in this case, I'm going to surround the whole select statement, and I will explain why in just a second here. And then what I want to do is, I'm going to get rid of this generated comment here, is I basically want to select all fields from, and oops, let me correct that. Basically what I'm doing is I'm selecting all fields from table my table. But my table has a alias of this entire select statement right here. So if I run it, notice I get exactly the same data back. It's a subset. But watch this. Let's say in my select statement I eliminate all of this information here. And I rerun it. Now the select star is coming from a subset of managers, but that's all it sees. In fact, watch this. If I run this statement right here, that's all the data that I'm getting back. So if I do a select star from it, I'm going to get all the data in here back. Just like that. But of course now, if that's the case, then if this represents a table, so basically what we could do, if you want to think of this in simplicity, okay, imagine that that's not here right now. What we end up with is something like this. Okay, what would my my field list be if all I wanted was the player ID and the year ID? Okay, so I'm going to undo this, and that's all I'm going to type up here is player ID, year ID. Now, it has to match what's inside of this statement, and I'll show you in a minute what I'm talking about. But when I run it, now I'm only going to get those two columns back. Even though this statement in the middle returned everything back, I said of that, and that's called my table, I only want the player ID and the year ID. So what again it shows you is that data as it's returned is returned as an entity that is seen as another table out there. Let's even go a step further. Let me show you what else I can do here. And again, this is review. And this is before we go back in and solve that problem. Okay. Let's imagine now that we're back in here and we're looking at players. Okay. So here's a really quick little dirty tool here. Watch this. If I do select star from players, just like that, okay, then I highlight this guy. This is just a trick. I do a right click, I come down and say design query in the editor. What it will do is it will take that asterisk and it will convert it into the fields so that when I click OK, watch this. Saves me, again, from having to type all those fields in, or from having to go back in there, select that table, and click on all those different fields. Because if I clicked on the star the first time in that builder, it's going to return a star back. But if I re-edit it, it will return all the fields back in here. Now, let's imagine now that right in the middle of this, what I'd like to do right after I've got the weight here is I want to have another column over here right after it, and I want to show in that column the average weight of everybody. Okay, so what I could do here is, I like baby steps, folks. Everything you got to do in baby steps is to calculate what the average weight of everybody is. So I want to select average, and then I'm going to average the weight right here from, and in this case I'm going to do players. And let's run that and make sure. Now notice I haven't given it a column header yet here, and I'll show you why in a second. I can, it's not important. Okay, and it comes back and it says 185. So what I want to do, I'm going to do a column header, but I'm going to use a different method for it. Is I'm going to take that select statement right here, I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to move right over here, right after my weight column, and right here I'm going to paste that select statement in here, but I'm going to do it within parentheses. Let me just double check and see how I did it below. Yep, I'm going to do it within parentheses here. Control V. Okay, now I'm going to give it a column header after that. I'm going to call it that whole select statement there. I'm going to call it overall AVG, comma. Now before I go on, let me make this a little bit more readable here so we can analyze what I've done. So in place of one column here, what I've done is I've selected an entire column. So this is going to represent one column, and it's going to then return back the average weight. So let's see if that's going to work here, folks. Let's run it, and let's move across and find weight, and you'll see now that I have my weight, and then I have my overall average. My overall average is 185. Now, great use of it, but the problem is this is not the most efficient select statement, and the reason is that every time it grabs a row, it's going to run that select statement that generates the average. Later, if we were going to use Advanced SQL, we would generate the average to a variable and just display it in the column. But as it is right now, every time this line is run, it grabs that weight. Then the next thing it does is it calculates the overall average from the entire table. Then it continues on, then it does the next row, and it goes through that entire process again. But it does work. And it just really depends on the kind of speed that you need returned back. Sometimes something like this is going to work just great. You saw how fast it was here. And what are we dealing with? We're dealing with 18,846. But if you were dealing with a large volume, say, for example, a large corporation that makes a lot of different sales every hour of every day, you might find that there was a delay in doing this. So there might be, again, better ways. But you see what it did is it placed that value right in that particular column. So I could put that value, that column in there and have it represented, but I could also do more things with it. I could use it in a calculated column. So perhaps rather than saying I want to know what the weight is by itself, what the overall average weight is, I want to know what the difference of the weight is. So I want to know, are they greater than 185 pounds, or are they less than 185 pounds? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take their base weight right here, and I'm going, in that same column, I'm going to say take the weight, subtract from it the average weight, and then what we're going to do is we're going to call it the difference. The difference. Oh, not the Irish version of it. It would be just the difference here. And let's see what we can come up with now. So we run it, and now we should find out now that this person, David Ardzima, is 35 pounds greater than the average weight, whereas Hank Aaron was 5 pounds less than the average weight, which is pretty amazing that he was that light, was able to hit that many home runs. But you should get an idea now of the fact that I can replace columns. I can do a lot of cool stuff. This is really where, if you sit down and you think about what you can do and you really challenge yourself, this is the power use that comes up. This is the people that can really get the high-end jobs in writing these select statements and being developers at the same time. And there's a lot of money to be made in that aspect of it. So now let's go back and take a look at that problem that we had before and see how we can figure that out, perhaps even using what we just looked at. So if I pull that problem up again, it says, in a single select, which manager has the greatest number of wins? So what I want to do most likely is I want to have, let's just start off with the basics. I want to start off with the manager, or let's do the player ID, just to start with. And then we need to come up with the number of wins. So we're going to have two different columns in here. Remember, I said you always have to visualize this first. So I want to have, first of all, the player ID and the number of wins. So if I come back over here and I look at the managers table, again, as we talked about before, I have a player ID and I have number of wins, or at least I have wins in that given season. So every year they've played, they'll have a different manager record, and that's how they keep track of it. So what I'd like to know is during their entire career, what would the sum of their wins be? So that's exactly what we're talking about here. So we want to have the player, to start with the player ID, and then we want to have the sum of the wins. I can't do count because then I would have count how many times they had a win, they had wins, but I wouldn't be counting the total number of wins, and that's a common error that's made. So again, if I want to put this in front of a select statement, I would write in my select player ID, comma, sum of the wins, and we're going to call it total wins from, and this is from managers. Now, if I try to run this, of course, I'm going to get an error because I'm trying to mix a column with an aggregate function. So I have to group by player ID. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's group by player ID. Let's see what we come up with now. Well, that should be W, right? So it probably wouldn't have worked to begin with. And then you'll notice then what I get is I get the manager and how many total wins during their career they had. Let's order this by total wins just to get an idea. So order by total wins. And we want the largest to smallest, so let's do descending. Okay, oops. And let's see what we come up with then. Probably should, if I want to be consistent here, name it the same way. And then let's execute it. And it tells me then that what ultimately we want to have happen is we want this name pulled out with 37-31 wins, or again 37-31 wins, or anybody that has a tie. So again, of course, today what I could do is I could type in select top one player ID, but the challenge is let's say that this person right here, if they were still playing baseball, which I don't know if they are or not, if they ever achieved 37-31 and then just stopped playing, because I can tell you this person here is Connie Mack, he's already retired, long gone. If this person then happened to tie Connie Mack and have 37-31, if I put top one in here, I'd always only get the top player, and it might not even be Connie Mack. It might be this second person that happened to have 37-31. Not until this second person exceeded 37-31 would a top one work. Now, again, odds are it would probably be pretty accurate. The odds that somebody would retire with exactly 37-31 is pretty remote. But again, if we're going to write the select statement, we need to write it the right way. Okay, so what we want to do then is somehow we want to figure out how can we pull out this top record right here. Okay, this top record. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go back in and we need to figure out how do we generate this top number right here? Now, what it requires us to do, folks, is it requires us to think as though this is a table. Pause for a moment. Again, you got to do this in baby steps. If you're looking at this, and was a table, let's imagine it's a table that only had 2 columns in it. Okay, it had a player ID in it, and it had a total wins in it. How could you generate the largest number from this? Okay, let's say that we got a table and it's called total manager win. I think I could do something like this. I could do something like a select, right, the maximum total wins from, and then whatever table this would be called, it might be called, like I said a minute ago, it might be called total manager wins. So again, don't make this hard, make this very simple here. If you had a table and only had 2 columns and I want to know what the largest number of this column is, I could use an aggregate function and say, give me from this column that row that had the largest number of total wins. So that's a total wins column. And where'd this come from? I just made this up. So all I did is I said, if this was a table, again, how could we generate it? But now let's go a step further. And I'm going to take this order by out. We don't need this really. That was just to show us Connie Mack popped up at the top. But I do know now that this guy generates a table. And in this table, there's a total wins column. So what I'm going to do, folks, is I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to tell it to grab the maximum total wins from the table that was used, or excuse me, the select statement that was used to generate this guy right here. So, and I'll use this same name here. So right after this, I'm going to put close parentheses, and right in the middle of that, I'm going to copy this select statement. In fact, let's do it this way. I'm going to take this select statement right here, I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to paste it right here. Boom. Okay, so now when I run this guy, let's see what I end up with. I end up with the total, and notice I don't have a column header from it because I didn't give it right here, because I'm generating from it, so we have to give it right here. Let's try that again. We'll call it greatest wins. Let's rerun it again. Okay, now there's my number. That number right there is the number that we're looking for. We were able to pull out the largest number from the wins column, that number that we looked at a minute ago that was Connie Mack's, and we'll prove that in just a minute here. And so notice again what happened is I was able from that statement to generate the greatest number of wins. Now let's go back over here to this statement here. So now I've got this statement back again. And in this column, I have the total wins right here. Right here. So what I really want to do now is I want the grouping, this grouping right here, that has the total number of wins that are equal to 3731. So I could do this. I could say having the sum W, total number of wins, that is equal to 3731. Just like that. Okay, and let's run it again, baby steps. And there it is. I've brought open, then at that point, Connie Mack. We'll find that out in a second, but that player ID, and I get the total number of wins. That's what I'm ultimately looking for, but the problem is I've hard-coded that 3731 in. I want that to be generated. I don't want to hard-code it in because it's going to change perhaps throughout history. Not going to always be 3731, but if I run this statement right here, it will always return back what the greatest number of wins are at any point if it changes from 3731. So that's exactly what I'm going to do, folks, is I'm going to get rid, let's put some space in between here to prove this. I'm going to get rid of that 3731 and I'm going to replace it with parentheses here. And just to make it more readable, now I'm going to put inside those parentheses the statement that was used to generate that 3731 or whatever number it will be in the future, just like that. And check this out. I get Connie Mack 3731, and this will be reusable over and over and over again. Now, let's talk a little bit more about how we can go on from here. Okay, what I really want to do now is, and this is really, folks, if you were going to have answered the problem, I would have been just happy as a lark had you just turned this in as it is right here. This is a more difficult problem, but again, if you walk through it in baby steps, you should be able to get through any of these problems. But let's go even a step further now. What I want to do is I don't know who Mac CO01 is. You remember earlier I said whenever you can you want to use a builder, but there's going to be times when builders won't work. Builders don't work very well when you're dealing with complex grouping statements. Builders don't work when you're doing a select from within another select statement, or you're doing something that we've done up above. They don't work. So this is why builders are great when they're there to save you time. But a lot of times you're not going to be able to use the builder, so you still have to understand exactly how to do these things by hand. So that's exactly what we're going to do now. We're going to come back in here, and what I want to do is I want to join, and this is again that table right here. I want to join this table right here with my players table so that I can get back, return to me the actual name of what this individual is here. Now, because in this case I'm going to do a inner join, it's not going to matter which table is going to be my parent table, whether it's going to be the players table which has the name in it, because every name, if I make the players table my parent table and I do an inner join, I'm only going to get back one record, and that's going to be Connie Mack's record right here, or I assume it's going to be Connie Mack's record here. If I make this this table right here the parent table, and I join it to the players table, then I'm just going to get this one record back, and it's going to jump over to player, and it's going to grab the player name. Again, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It makes no difference. But I think to lay this out right now, it's going to be easier for me to make the player table the parent table in here. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and delete this code out here at the bottom. Okay, so this is the guy that generates that data here. So I'm going to come down below here and I'm going to start building my join table. And in order to do that, I'm going to jump down and take a look at players to begin with. So what I want to do now is, I'm going to come back here and rerun this guy. Okay, so here this generates an entire statement. What I want to do here is, I don't really need, and I think I can take this guy out right now, this name of this table embedded in it. Let's see if it'll let me get rid of this, and there's a reason for that madness here. It didn't. So it required me to give it a table name, so I'm going to put that back in again. And the reason I say it is because I need to have a table name that I'm going to call this. What am I going to call this select statement? So for right now, and I'm going to put this in as a comment, let's come back in and say we're going to call this one high wins. So I'm just, again, in the back of my mind, I'm going to keep that there, and I'm going to use high wins just as a placeholder when I'm coming back in and I'm building my select statement. So we're going to refer then that all of this data right here is going to be called high wins. So I would do a select, and I want to grab from players the name first. Okay, then I also probably want to call from players, I want to call in the name last. Then let's put right at the very beginning of that too, let's put the player ID from players. And I could pull the player ID from either one of my tables too, because you'll notice that down below here I have a player ID in this particular table. So it doesn't matter which one I pull, because once they're joined, it shouldn't make any difference whatsoever. But I'm going to do it off of the player table. So that would be player ID PK. So off of the players table, I want player ID PK. Player. Okay. Then, so players, player ID, PK. Okay. Then after that, assuming I have this table below me called high wins, I want high wins, okay, dot total wins. Something like that. Okay, so those are the columns that I would expect to have show up when I get this taken care of. And then I want to grab all that data from the parent. So we're going to use, we'll use in this case players. I might have said contacts a minute ago, I meant players. From players, okay. And then what I want to do is I want to inner join. I only want players that have children, so I'm doing an inner join, and I'm going to inner join total manager wins, high wins, okay, on, and in this particular case I'm going to say I want to join, and again this won't work if I run it right now because there is no high wins table. I'm just creating this as though there was. Again, I want to keep that perfectly clear here. So I'm joining high wins on players dot player ID PK is equal to the player ID that we have down below here, player ID. So I think everything here is made to work. The only challenge that we have right now is we do not have a table called high wins. Had I had a player table called high wins that looked like this, I believe this would work. We're going to find out right here, because here's what we're going to do. I'm going to tell the computer that this data right here will represent high wins. So I'm going to copy it, and right there I am going to join that table. Now again, folks, if you try to envision this from the very beginning, look at this statement. This statement looks uber complicated, and I'm not even going to guarantee right now it's going to work the first time through. We might have to go back in and debug it. But what you have to do is you have to do this in baby steps. And it's very doable if you do it in baby steps. Let's see what ends up happening when I run this. Uh-oh. Oh, let's try the whole thing. Did I mess up here? Let me come back and Control Z again here. So before I go on, I want to join. Let me just rerun this, make sure I got everything taken care of. That's right. And I want to join the results of that statement right there. I want to call it, that's what happened, is I didn't run this last line down below when I run that statement, as high wins. And let's see what we end up with. Again, the same problem here. So let's see what we got here. It says on line 13, period. So let me look just through my code here and see what I got. Name first, name last, from players. Name first, name last, player ID, players, player ID, PK. Let me pause for a second and see if I can figure this out. Okay, folks, as I sit here and ponder away, I've realized what the problem is, and I probably should practice a little bit what I preach and always take a look and read the screen a little bit. And as I look at the screen here, I notice that right after players.playerIDPK that I've got this underlined red here, and then I've got the second column, and there's another underline here in red. And as I look closely, I see that right here, I forgot to put my comma in. It's that simple. And again, looking at the complicated aspect of this page, you got to be really careful. It's not so difficult, again, if you do baby steps on here. And I go ahead and I run it, and you see that I end up, as you saw a moment ago, with the Connie Mac at 3,731 total wins. So wasn't that difficult to come up and solve that particular problem. But a couple things I want you to take note again is you want to be really careful to always, whenever you're going to go back in there and you're going to have a statement that's going to represent a table, okay, then you want to always be sure to put a alias. Everything should be an alias. So you'll notice here that that first select statement generated an alias we called total manager wins. That's what generated the 3731. And then we included the player ID inside of that, and we called that entire table high wins. And think of these folks in terms of temporary tables, but they're not really temporary tables in the fact that a temporary table will stay alive during the entire session. These tables right here that you're generating will stay alive only when you're running a select statement. The moment that my statement was over, they're wiped out of memory. The only thing that is retained in memory is going to be the generated select statement that you see down below here. So as far as it's concerned, it has no clue that this complicated statement was used to generate this data. All it knows is that this data right here exists. And I mean, I could play with this data if I wanted to. I mean, right here alone, I could do a select from all of that data, and in that particular case, I could pull from any one of these particular 4 columns. So, as I mentioned before, this is important for you to understand. This is what separates the power users from those people that simply can go out there, use a builder, and write a select statement. That builder has a place. It's there to save you time. It's there to save your client time when you're doing some of the simple stuff that you have to do. But when you have to lay it out, do something like this, it's going to be crucially important that you know how to go back in there and write your selects. And before I go on, let's play around a little bit with this statement. If I had not done an inner join, if I had done a left outer join, let's see what would have ended up happening here. That's probably not a good place to do it. Well, let's try it anyway here. It's going to change things. I think it's going to wreck everything. See what ends up happening. Yep. See what it did is it gave me everybody back, those people that were never ever managers. So the only people that would ever be a manager now are those that had total wins. So remember, I'm getting every parent back, every player ever, but only those that were managers will have a filled in total number of wins. And you're going to see that managers in this table, I'm probably zooming through fast for the screen capture down below here, but they're few and far between. So that's what you ended up with it. So going back here, let's do a Control Z here and change that back to an inner join. An inner join only gives me parents, which is 1, that had children. So the only record that would have been filled in that previous select where I had changed that to a left outer join would have been Connie Mac's record. So hopefully this made a little bit of sense. You can go back through, follow along. If I still have that problem 5, it's being done for you. I would suggest that you still go ahead and you do it yourself. If I don't have that problem 5 any longer, then chalk this up to a good learning experience.